The unexpected passing of Senator Lindsey Graham this week came as a reminder that none of us, not politicians, celebrities, billionaires, spiritual teachers, or ordinary people, are exempt from the same reality. Graham was actively serving in the United States Senate, traveling internationally, making plans, and engaging in public life. Then, suddenly, he was gone. His death, attributed to an unexpected cardiovascular event, surprised people across the political spectrum. Whether we admired him, opposed him, or felt indifferent towards his politics doesn't ultimately matter. Death has a way of stripping away the labels that consumed so much of our attention while we were alive. Republican, Democrat, conservative, progressive, Christian, atheist, gay, straight, American, immigrant, rich, poor. Eventually, every identity we defend, every opinion we argue over, every belief system we cling to, and every psychological story we tell ourselves dissolves. Death is the great equalizer. Ironically, this reality is often the very thing we spend our lives trying not to think about. We build careers, accumulate possessions, seek recognition, argue over ideology, and defend identities as though they are permanent. Yet every human being who has ever lived has reached the same destination. Perhaps this isn't something to fear. Perhaps it is something to understand. For many years, I have reflected on what consciousness actually is. I've come to believe that our deepest essence is not the personality we temporarily inhabit. The individual self, the collection of memories, beliefs, preferences, fears, and personal history we call me, appears to be a psychological construction arising within consciousness rather than consciousness itself. When the physical body dies, I don't believe this individual identity continues unchanged somewhere else in the universe. Our memories, opinions, and personal narratives belong to this particular life. They are expressions of a temporary form. What continues, in my view, is consciousness itself. Just as a wave returns to the ocean without losing anything essential, our individual experience returns to the larger field from which it emerged. Consciousness is never destroyed. It simply ceases to express itself through this particular body and this particular mind. Then, in ways far beyond our understanding, consciousness expresses itself again. Not as you with all of your memories, not as me carrying my biography, but as another unique manifestation of the same underlying reality. This perspective changes how I think about life. If consciousness is fundamental, then our deepest identity has never truly been separate from anyone else's. The divisions we fight over begin to look remarkably temporary, and perhaps that is exactly what we are witnessing today. Across the United States, and increasingly around the world, we have become attached to psychological identities. Politics has become identity. Religion has become identity. Nationality has become identity. Race, gender, ideology, profession, and even the media we consume have become identities that many people feel compelled to defend at all costs. We are no longer simply discussing ideas. We have become the ideas themselves. Once that happens, disagreement feels like a threat to our very existence. Compassion gives way to certainty. Curiosity gives way to tribalism. Human beings stop seeing one another as fellow travelers and begin seeing only the labels they wear. Yet physical death reminds us that none of these identities survive. The body returns to the earth. The personality disappears. The story, at least as we have known it, comes to an end. If this is true, why wait until death to let these identities go? Perhaps one of life's greatest invitations is to experience a kind of psychological death while we are still alive. Can we release the stories we've inherited about who we are supposed to be? Can we loosen our attachment to being right, being superior, being the victim, being the hero, or belonging to one side against another? These questions challenge us to examine whether the identities we defend are serving us or quietly imprisoning us. Every time we allow one of these identities to fall away, something remarkable happens. We do not become less alive. We become more alive. What initially feels like a loss often becomes an opening. As the mind loosens its grip on fixed beliefs and carefully constructed narratives, we discover a deep sense of peace, curiosity, and connection with others. It is as though each small psychological death makes room for a much larger life. Reflective writing has taught me this lesson repeatedly. Whenever I write honestly about my assumptions, fears, beliefs, and personal narratives, I discover that many of them are not permanent truths at all. They are simply stories my mind learned to tell. Once they are examined with compassion rather than defended out of habit, they begin to dissolve. What remains is not emptiness, but clarity, a quiet awareness that exists beneath the constant activity of thought. Perhaps physical death is not entirely unlike falling asleep. Every night we surrender our conscious identity. The world we defended throughout the day disappears, and for several hours the person we believe ourselves to be quietly fades into the background. Then we awaken and reconstruct that familiar identity once again. Physical death may simply be this final surrender of that temporary psychological self, not an ending to consciousness, but the completion of one expression of it before another begins. None of us can know with certainty what lies beyond death. My reflections are simply one way of understanding a mystery that every human being will eventually encounter. Yet, regardless of our spiritual or religious beliefs, we all share one undeniable reality. Each of us will someday face the end of this physical life. The question then is not whether we will die. The more meaningful question is whether we will truly live before we do. Perhaps the greatest preparation for physical death is learning to let our psychological selves die first. As we release our rigid identities, we begin to discover something larger than the stories we have spent our lives defending. An awareness that is naturally compassionate, deeply connected, and not confined by temporary labels of this lifetime. If consciousness itself is the enduring reality, then death is not the enemy. It is simply the great reminder that we were never truly separate from one another in the first place. To learn more about death, consciousness, and reflective writing, be sure to check out my book, Odyssey of Heroes, How to Rewrite Your Life, available to purchase on Amazon, both in paperback and in Kindle versions. I hope you have a wonderful day,